Hey everyone, Jason from Alphatone Audio back again, and today, like I did in my last video, I just want to do a simple assembly just because I want to do different assemblies with different parts just to show you things I do on a very consistent basis, but also show you small variations that I do based on which particular parts I'm working on. So in this video, I'm going to do just a straightforward standard guitar cable, and I'm going to use G&H plugs, and I've got some Mogami 2524. I'm going to use two different plugs. I'm going to use the straight plug on one end, and I'm going to use the right angle plug on the other. So on the straight plug, it's three parts. You have the plug, you have the barrel, and then you have the insulator shield in the middle. On the right angle, you have the barrel, you have a cap that goes on, and then you have the plug part, and the insulator is built into this one. I have 10 feet worth of cable, and I have two pieces of 3/8 inch heat shrink. I cut those about 2 inches long, and I'm actually building these for my friends down at a local music store that stock my products, so I'm going to have their little ID heat shrink on there as well. So the first thing is when I cut the cable, this is going to be a 10-foot cable. I actually cut it to about 10 feet 1 inch. I always cut a little bit longer just because it gives me a little bit more options on termination when I go to dress everything up, and I'll show you why in just a minute. So the very first thing I'm going to do is on these plugs, I'm going to strip back about 3/4 of an inch. Got my ruler right here. Just going to roll that utility knife along the outside. And you can actually just finish it like this. And then pull it off. And then once you cut one, you can use that. I kind of know what 3/4 of an inch is at this point because I've done many cables. And again, when you're doing this, a sharp knife is better than a dull knife. So now I have these two, and this is a spiral shield on this. What I want to do is I want to be really careful. I just want to take all the little individual conductors and I want to pull them all together. And I want to get everything to one side. I don't want all these little individual conductors coming out all around. I want them to come out of one spot. And once I get that, I'm going to grip these pretty tightly. And you can be pretty firm with this stuff. These individual strands, they're pretty thick. It's pretty strong stuff. So I'm going to grab these really tight to the cable. And I'm going to just take this insulation. I'm just going to pull it back. And it's going to go back like, I don't know, like 1/8 of an inch. And once it does, then I'm going to get a really tight twist on this. And then I'm just going to, like, that little bit I pulled back, I'm just going to feed it back over, just so it gives me a little cleaner exit on that shield. Do the same thing on the other side. Depending on what cable you'll get a little bit more pullback than others. Yeah, I'm just kind of looking for a natural point where they all kind of want to go together. Right there. Pull it back. It's only going to go like 1/8 of an inch or so. Get the nice tight twist on there. And then feed this back out. Now this cable, like many instrument type cables, you don't see it on XLR cables or anything like that. It does have this extra PVC layer on here, and that helps to reduce microphonics. Basically, it means that any static charge or extra charge that builds up inside the cable as a result of it moving is going to keep it from jumping from the shield into the conductor and into your signal. So I'm just going to score that with my utility knife. I'm going to peel it off. Depending on the brand of cable, some of it is kind of thin and you can just scratch off with your thumbnail. But this stuff they use in the Mogami cable is pretty thick. So just lightly score it, utility knife. And easily tears off from there. Okay, let's get the soldering iron heated up and get this stuff tinned. Okay, from here, getting ready to strip this and then tin it. And I said originally I was going to go with a strip length about 3/4 of an inch, which you can see what you want is This outer jacket, you want this to come up just a little bit past, maybe 1/8 of an inch, 1/16 of an inch, past the two wings here. And you can see on my conductor, it's going almost like a full 1/4 inch into the solder tab, so that looks about right. So I'm going to take good old-fashioned wire strippers. I'm going to take about 3/16. I'm going to do both at one time. I tend to batch similar operations for efficiency when I'm doing lots of cables. Give that a good twist, and also make sure you got a good twist on your shield at this point. Now, why do you tin this? Well, one, because you want the flux in the solder to clean it so you get a good joint, for sure. But the other reason is it's going to help to control it, which means you don't want little individual pieces of wire flying off, because that's how you can get shorts and things like that. You always want to control your materials. So just a little bit, and I'm going to do a little bit on the shield. You don't have to do the whole thing, because obviously a lot of this is just going to get cut off. So I just want to put a little bit on, and I always tin it first and then cut it, because then once I tin it, when I cut it, I know I'm not going to get any flyaways, because I'm always going to cut it where it's been tinned. Okay. And then when I go to cut the shield, and I talk a lot about really being precise and doing really clean, repetitive work, but there's so much tolerance on these guitar plugs, it really doesn't matter a whole lot. You can be within 1/8 of an inch easily on any of this stuff. However, when you cut your shield back, always make sure that when you cut it back, it's always farther back than where the insulation ends for your conductor, just so you don't get any overlap. Something like that. So this ends before the insulation ends on the conductor. That's on one, and that's on the other. And again, I'm cutting where I tinned, so I'm not going to get any flyaway copper. So it's always a good point, or a good tip at this point. You want to make sure that you start sliding things on so you don't get too far ahead of yourself. I have our badge, and that's going to go on first, because that's essentially going to go somewhere maybe in the middle of the cable. And then, like I said, I'm going to take the insulator, I'm going to put it inside, and then that's going to go on. And then I'm going to take one of my pieces of heat shrink and I'm going to put it on. Now, a couple reasons for the heat shrink. You don't really need it. And if I'm using Neutrik plugs, I don't use it at all, because I feel like it messes with the strain relief a little bit. A lot of people like to see the strain relief though, and that's really kind of why I put it on there, because I think it adds a little bit of extra just strain relief, because cables always break at the end, because that's always where they get bent, like right at the very end of the barrel here, right? So some people think it adds a little bit of strain relief there. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. I don't know. It can't add too much, but it's not going to hurt either. Now, if you do use the strain relief on these, though, you technically don't need that little insulator in there, and that insulator is just to make sure that the tip is not going to ground out to the shield here. Typically, you really only need like one or the other, but if you're going to go with the heat shrink for the extra strain relief, then you don't necessarily need the insulator in there. You can certainly use both, which is what I like to do, but it's just going to get a little bit tighter when you assemble it, but do what you like to do on that. So now, take a look at your plug. You can see there's always going to be like a little bit of a bend to it, and these always look slightly different when they come out of the box. So we have, of course, this part is straight, and I have this large solder tab here, and it kind of angles out a little bit, and I have the center conductor tab, and it angles up a little bit. Okay, you're never going to be able to get this thing assembled like this, so I'm always going to take this bottom, the large tab, that's going to get bent up, and of course this top tab is going to get bent down at about a 15-degree angle. And I always like to do this before I solder it, because after you solder it, these get a little bit stiff. Okay, so then the only reason you do that is because then when I slip that outer barrel in there, the assembly is going to go a lot easier. You're not going to have to crank this thing. Okay, now from there, I'm going to take my conductor, the center, it's going to slide in from the top to the bottom, and I do that for a very specific reason. I don't like to go from the bottom to the top, because then I'm actually building up height here, and again, that's just reducing the amount of clearance between this top solder tab and the outer barrel on that. Now when I do that, it looks like the edge of my outer jacket here, it's coming up just a little bit short. That's no problem. We did go a little bit extra long on that, so I'm just going to trim this back a little bit. better to have it too long and be able to trim it back than cut it too short and have to go back and restrip more outer jacket and all that. So place that in, and now my outer jacket is past my tabs here, which is what I want. Then it's just a matter of needle nose pliers coming in, squeeze those down. Nothing scientific about it. I usually just don't like them to overlap. I like it to kind of dig down into that outer jacket a little bit so you get that good friction strain relief. And then from there, now obviously my center conductor is coming down at an angle. I like to come in with the needle nose pliers and just make sure that that wire is flush up against the bottom of the solder tab on there. And it's the same thing with the shield here. You don't want a gap in between the shield and the tab, because then you have to fill it in with a bunch of solder, and you don't necessarily need to do that. So I just want no clearance whatsoever, then the solder will just flow around the wire and the solder tab. And from there, pretty simple. Soldering iron is ready to go. Just going to bring it in, turn this a little bit so you can see. That goes easy. When I do this, I just want to make sure that that hole is completely covered, and that solder is going to flow all the way down and around. And if you look on the inside, that entire center conductor should be covered with solder. Now, you can actually put quite a bit down here on the shield. So when you do that, whenever I'm gripping the solder, don't grip it right up here to the end, because especially the thinner your solder, the more you have to feed in. So on something like this where I know I'm going to be feeding quite a bit in, I always make sure my fingers are about 3 inches back from the edge of the solder, so I can really, once the heat starts going, I can really just drive it in. So in, and then it just flows right in. I'm going to feed about 2 inches in. I'm just going to get a nice big pool of shiny solder. It's going to flow up and around the shield. And that's it. So I'm going to keep going with the assembly, and we'll come back and do the heat shrink. So again, outer barrel goes on. Heat shrink goes on. Again, we're just going to double check. Same thing here. I'm going to bend down a little bit. I'm going to go top to bottom. Now there's a big kind of block right underneath this tab, so probably not going to have quite as much room for this tab as you are on the straight plug. And again, I probably don't need quite as much length on that shield. I don't like it to get too close to the conductor on these. That's going to come straight down. And again, I've got good overlap here. My outer jacket is coming up past my wings here. Tighten those down. So everything here, make sure nothing's flying away. Good contact there. My shield. It's nice and flush with that big solder tab at the bottom. And then we solder. That's the tip. And then again, give myself a couple inches. Feed this in. Gonna give it quite a bit. It's probably impossible to put too much on. Well, I take that back. You don't really, the thing about these is if this strain relief ever does fail, and this solder, if you let it flow all the way back, which is why when I originally tinned this, I just put a little bit on there, and it's really just to keep the actual individual copper fibers from unraveling. If this strain relief ever fails, and that's just a huge big glob of solder, and that's going all the way back, that basically takes that flexible copper shield on there, and it makes it more rigid because it's completely filled with solder, and that's the first place it's ever going to break. So it's always really nice if you have, like right here on this spot, if there's actually not solder on that part of the wire right there, just because it is one last fail safe in case this ever really gets yanked and the cable stretches past the strain relief. Not a guarantee, just something to think about. Okay. So now I have the cheapest heat gun you can get on Amazon, which is going to work just fine for our needs. So, and because I have the right angle here, we'll start with that. So back to this insulator tab. Again, this is going to make sure that this entire top section up here, which is your tip, is not going to ground out on the shell when we're bringing it up for the assembly. So the reason I really like to use the heat shrink on this is because it's going to make sure that this stays in place. So I'm actually going to tuck this underneath the heat shrink. Because I've actually had these where I hadn't used this before, where as you go to twist this down tightly, it's actually kind of pushes this over to the side and it had shorted out. So now whenever I'm using these right angles, I always use the heat shrink just to make sure that this insulation tab stays put. So once that's that, this slides up. Our cap just fits on top. And that just comes right up and screws on. And it should be easy. Shouldn't really have to force it. Okay, that's one side. Go to the other. Again, this can come up all the way to the threads. Make sure it really shrinks down. And the shell comes up, and it should just come straight up. If it's not, it means you still have a bend in there somewhere. Comes back up the threads. The first one or two are usually a little stiff, and then it goes on pretty easily. Okay. And of course, we have our badge. And that's that. Of course, now we're going to test. I don't use cable testers. I just use a multimeter. Just looking for simple continuity test. So of course we're going to test shield to shield. You get continuity. Tip to tip. You get continuity. And then always check for shorts. Check shield to tip. You should get nothing, which we don't. So now we have a good cable. And that's all there is to it. So one of the reasons I wanted to do this is for people that maybe hadn't done any cables yet and maybe just looking at doing their own guitar cables or pedal board cables or something like that. These G&H plugs, these are pretty much some of the easiest plugs that you can get to solder onto. They're pretty affordable. Lots of places sell them. They are a good quality plug. They're pretty reliable. So you don't, and like I said, they're about the easiest plug that you can get. And again, when you're using like a large gauge cable like this 2524 or something like that, there's a lot of room for error. You don't really have to be super tight on the tolerance or something like that. And again, for pedal boards, I actually kind of like these right angle cables or right angle plugs here, especially if you tend to like swap things in and out all the time, or you just tend to like always just set, you don't really use a board, you just set up all your pedals all the time, just because they're very large, which means they're very durable, and they're just very easy to grab and plug in and out of your pedals. So they can just be a little more convenient for stuff like that. So again, this is just one variation of a guitar cable. Of course, there are tons of guitar cables out there to choose from. Lots of cable companies like myself do only guitar cables. I do sell them as well. I just tend to not talk that much about them because I don't really feel that they're that much more special than anything else I make. So I hope this has been helpful for you. If it has been helpful, please consider subscribing or leaving a like. And as always, leave a comment. Let me know what you think. Let me know how you do your own guitar cables. And I will see you next time.